I just want to say welcome to everybody that's on the call. So we had over 145 people register for this. So it just shows how, even in these strange times, people are really interested in this idea surrounding the GEO LDN initiative. So I'd like to welcome you into the GEO LDN Initiative online data user consultation workshop that's all about data quality standards. Just to give you a quick overview about what we're going to talk about in the next hour and a half or so, I will first off just tell you a little bit about the workshop and how it's going to work. And then we'll get some context from GEO itself about the process. I will then tell you about the consultation process as it's happened so far. We'll together go through some of the proposed standards and also some of the draft decision trees that have been made. And after a few additional questions at the end, we'll wrap up with some final words. So first off, I just want to explain a little bit about what we're trying to get out of this workshop. So the main thing I would say, as Michael has been saying in the warm-up, is please use the chat as much as you can. Make sure that you send your comments to all panelists and attendees. But we will be asking for your thoughts and opinions throughout the presentation. And the main way that you'll know that we're asking for specific input is to look out for the chat pane image in the slides. So as you can see on this slide, we've got a red arrow with the chat pane next to it. So every time you see that, we're looking for specific input from you. But at any point throughout the entire workshop process, please do use the chat to write down any thoughts or queries or questions that you have. I just want to let you know that this is your opportunity to feed into the consultation process. And also that we have a small but dedicated team on the back end who will be monitoring the chat and responding where they can, but as there are over 100 of you potentially feeding into this, please just sort of bear with us if we're not able to answer specific questions in this session. If there's anything that we need to follow up on, we will try and do so afterwards. And just want to also say that please don't forget that the issues surrounding land degradation are incredibly complex. And these can be and have been discussed at length in the past. What we're doing now is part of a multi-stage process, and what we're trying to focus on is getting consensus. So unfortunately, not all the points that are raised through the process will be reflected in the final data quality standards, but your points are that you want to make are very welcome. So please, like I say, if you have any issues that you want to be raised, please raise them through the chat and we can try and reflect those as best as possible. And I suppose the last thing I want to say about this workshop is that the slides that we are presenting today are an update based on the information that has been gathered over the last couple of months in the process. So this isn't a final presentation telling you the answer. This is giving you a state of the nation almost as we are at the moment, and all of those things could change based on your input. So like I say, we really, really encourage you as much as possible to engage with this workshop. And with that, I'm going to just quickly hand over to my colleague, Doug, who's from GEO, to give a little bit of context.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay?
Sounds
yes.
Good to go.
Great. So this is really exciting. I'm glad to be here to witness this stage of the process. I think most of you are familiar with GEO. This is the GEO Land Degradation Neutrality Initiative. But just to kind of set the context in what we're doing here, I thought I would take you on a quick tour of the overall context in which this is happening. So GEO is the group on Earth observations, and you can see that in the slide format. And when we talk about Earth observations, we're interested in any type of observing platform that tells us what's happening in, on, and around the Earth. Next slide, please. We are interested in Earth observations because we want to make informed decisions, and decisions that are based on facts are particularly the kinds of decisions that we're looking for. Why is that? Well, because the decisions that are being made have far-reaching effects. They have an impact on human well-being, they have impacts on the environment and on the economy, and you can think of any number of other domains in which Earth observations are critical for informed decision-making. Next slide, please. So in 2005, after a series of Earth observing summits where the ministries of several countries, I think at the time it was about 50 different countries, came together, the decision was taken to start the Group on Earth Observations, an intergovernmental partnership that works towards improving the availability, the access and understanding and use of Earth observations for the benefit of society. So that's an important thing to remember, that GEO is a partnership above all. There is nothing binding about what GEO does. It is a best efforts enterprise in which the governments that are members within GEO are the driving force. Next slide, please. GEO is working, again, to open up access to Earth observations and their use to realize this vision in which a future where decisions and actions are made for the benefit of humankind and are informed by coordinated, comprehensive, and sustained Earth observation information and services. Next slide, please. So the membership of GEO, remember I said it's an intergovernmental partnership. We currently have 111 member governments participating in GEO, plus the European Commission. And you can see the countries that participate here in blue. The grayed out areas are where we still are working on increasing our membership. The Pacific Island nations also are hard to see. In fact, they're almost invisible on this map, but nonetheless, that's an area where we're also looking to actively increase membership. Next slide, please. GEO is also involving participating organizations. So even though GEO is essentially government-driven, organizations, in particular UN agencies, are very much a part of what GEO is doing. And you can see here, we have, actually this slide should be updated, we have over 120 different participating organizations, but you can see that they kind of run the spectrum from research institutes to those that are working on standards, for example, like the Open Geospatial Consortium. And I've circled in red the UNCCD. So the UNCCD, along with UNEP and the WMO and UNESCO and the WHO, are some of our key partners in achieving the goals that GEO is set out for. Next slide, please. So what exactly does GEO do? Well, the member governments and participating organizations within the GEO umbrella work together to develop and implement projects that involve Earth observations. And by projects, we typically are looking for applications or services that make the best use possible of Earth observations. And that involves a certain degree of capacity development, that involves a degree of coordination and also lobbying for open access to data. And so some of the key successes that GEO has had along the way is, for example, the Copernicus program that's supported by the European Commission has taken a policy towards full and open access to their satellite imagery. The same goes for USGS and the United States, who has opened up access to their Landsat archives for free usage. Next step, please. Now, to focus in just a little bit more, so we are talking about land degradation neutrality, and in particular SDG 15.3.1. The reason that GEO is interested in supporting its participating organizations and member governments with respect to the SDGs is because when the General Assembly approved the resolution on transforming our world for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, within the resolution, there is a reference to Earth observations and geospatial information. How, well, the resolution is calling for a greater exploitation of Earth observation data to help the member governments and the custodian agencies in their tracking of progress towards the SDGs. Next slide, please. So soon after this, the Committee on Earth Observation Satellites, and in particular supported by JAXA, the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency, which is the Japanese Space Agency, they did a survey of GEO member countries to determine to what degree they are using Earth observations for SDGs. And of the, there were 66 respondents, and 43 out of 66 indicated that they are currently using Earth observations for SDG analysis and reporting. And the rest, the remainder, 35%, said that they plan to use Earth observations with SDGs in the future. And the most common area of usage was, in particular, for SDG 15, either 15.1.1 on forest area or 15.3.1 on degraded land. So some of the challenges that were identified at that time that the survey was taken, which was a couple of years ago, was in terms of organization, capacity development, and data issues. And as you can imagine, there are a host of data issues, but one of which that surfaced was data quality. So we have, on the one hand, we have UNCCD, which is the custodian agency for 15.3.1, that is a member or a participating organization in GEO, coming to GEO and asking for help in the usage of Earth observations to report on 15.3.1. And at the same time, we have this survey that says, yes, countries are interested in this, and these are some of the issues that are being faced. So this is a happy coming together of supply and demand, if you will, and this has resulted in the GEO LDN Initiative. Next slide, please. So in terms of supporting SDG 15.3.1, it's critical to keep in mind that we want to ensure national ownership of this process. In other words, we would like to keep a degree of flexibility for countries to use their national data in reporting. So while the UNCCD has outlined a standardized approach here for reporting on SDG 15.3.1 that focuses on land cover, land productivity, and carbon stocks, we want to provide a framework in which national ownership is key, and we can provide that degree of flexibility so that can happen. In other words, we want to provide a framework such that there are options for countries to use Earth observations and other geospatial information and regional, global, or local data sources to complement the process. So next slide, please. So the GEO LDN Initiative is an initiative that has been formed to address this particular issue that we're going to talk about throughout the remainder of the workshop today. And that is data quality standards. It's a global process. You have been contacted as focal points for UNCCD, or if you perhaps work in the National Statistic Office, or you are involved in somehow in reporting, you have been contacted because GEO is using its global convening power to tackle this issue. And we are keenly interested in the end user, how the user is going to actually make use of this information that we're providing. GEO is all about tailoring its activities towards the end user, so that ultimately, as I pointed to in the vision, these Earth observations can be used for informed decision making. Next slide, please. So I think this is my final slide, or maybe I've got one more. Very briefly, the GEO LDN Initiative is divided up into 3 working groups. The first working group, Working Group 1, is devoted to capacity building and how we can best disseminate the use of Earth observations within the GEO LDN initiative as we're developing these tools, how we can spread the knowledge of that and the use of those tools. We are now in working group 2, this particular teleconference, to focus on data quality standards. What are the minimum set of data standards that will work in reporting on SDG 15.3.1. And then the working group number 3 on data analytics is looking at how we can put all of this together and provide a platform that will facilitate the use of Earth observations for reporting. Next slide. So in this process, again, we are interested in the end user, we're interested in the data provider, all of the components along the information chain, and we want to do this in a co-design process. So as you're probably aware, there's been a series of questionnaires that have gone out on the topic of data quality standards. We have now, with the thanks to Alistair, we have digested this information. He has come up with an initial set of decision trees on data quality standards that will provide guidance. And then once we have had a feedback with this group and other feedback that will come in electronically, we're going to provide this to the 3rd working group for the development of this federated collaborative platform. And then of course, working group 1 on capacity development is going to take this and do its best to ensure that all nations are able to make use of this information. So I think that's my last slide. So once again, I really am excited to be at this point and to hear your feedback to the work that's been done on identifying these decision trees. And I hope that you're glad to be here. I hope that this is going to prove to be a successful way for you to approach reporting on SDG 15.3.1, and that this will help you in that task. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Doug. That's great to hear the context for the whole process and to understand the interest of GEO in all of this work. And now I just want to go on and give you an overview of the consultation process so that we all understand how we've got to where we are today. First off, there's a team based around the working group 2 that Doug mentioned. So Doug and Florian are both from GEO, they represent GEO. Baron and Sarah, you might have come across, they represent UNCCD on the team. Antje and Hannah are both from GIZ, who are involved in the team as well. And myself and Michael are independent contractors who've been brought in to help push this forward alongside the various team members. So just to put some names and faces to the team behind Working Group 2, really. Okay, so the consultation process itself is multi-stage, and each stage builds on the other. So back at the beginning of 2020, I started with a review of the existing documentation, and then broadened that out into a global data provider and data specialist consultation process. And that took a couple of weeks in February and March. From that, the proposed standards and decision trees in draft were created. And then today we are undertaking the national data provider and data user consultation. And that's what this workshop and what the user survey, which I'll come on to mention in a couple of slides' time, is all about. From this, we're going to be then generating some proposed standards and some decision trees. And so we'll be discussing those in this workshop as well. One thing I'd like to just point out is that each of these layers builds on the one before it, and therefore we wouldn't be able to get to where we are now without having gone through the steps that we've gone through, and we wouldn't be able to get to the decision trees without having this very important step today. So just a couple of slides about the methodology, really. If successful, what we're going to end up with here is a series of proposed data quality standards for SDG indicator 15.3.1, which will then be considered in the revision and update of the good practice guidance. And hopefully many of you will have come across the first version of the good practice guidance. The methodology itself has three core components. So first off, it's formative, which means that each step builds on the previous step, which is what I tried to show in the previous slide, that without having something gone before it, we can't really move on in the process. The second is that it's purposive, which means that we start with those who have a rich knowledge of the area that we're looking at and a history of past engagement, and that we engage them again in this process and then move on through the process. And it's also inclusive, which means that there's an opportunity to engage. And that's what we're really trying to get to with this workshop, is the opportunity for all of you to engage in this multi-phase piece of work, which is the overall consultation. So just to give you a quick rundown of what's happened, like I say, the steps that were taken in February and March, targeted data providers, so that we understood a sort of what is possible in terms of data quality standards. And we undertook a series of online workshops that were initially supposed to be in person, but because of the pandemic, ended up being online, much like this one. This consultation then led to a draft technical note being produced. And again, if you got the invitation to join this, this workshop today, then there should have been attached a smaller version of the technical note, taking out some of the stuff that is still being worked on at the moment. This technical note is a live document, and as we carry on through the process, more and more gets added to it. As has been mentioned, there was also a survey that was sent out to the data users and the national data providers. The respondents for this were recommended from across each region, from those, and were taken from those that had been previously highly engaged with the process. And I suppose the most important thing for what we're talking about today is that this is the next step, and we are building on the knowledge gained from all the previous steps and trying to expand the discussion to all of the countries from all of the regions who are interested in the process surrounding SDG indicator 15.3.1. Just to give you a little bit of a statistical breakdown about the data user survey that I've mentioned. Like I say, we approached each of the different regions, and you can see here in the middle column the number of countries that were approached in each of those different regions. So we try to get as much of a balance as possible. And then you can also see the response rate we've had. But I think the most important number here is the total response rate, a 66% total response rate with just over a 1 week turnaround for the survey is absolutely amazing. And I really, really thank everybody who fed into that process. It's been amazing. Just to quickly give an overview graphically of what I've been talking about, on the top line here in gray, we have the series of steps that have been completed for the global data provider and the data specialist consultation. We ourselves today are now on this second line, and as I mentioned, the online survey has already happened. And we are inside the online data user workshop, as denoted here by the red dot and Michael's arrow. From this, we will pull together various bits of information, and we will create a series of decision trees, draft decision trees. The outcomes of the entire process will then be passed through to GEO LDN Working Group 3, and also to the Good Practice Guidance Update team. There will also be the creation of a technical note, which I've mentioned, which will record this update process and all of the information that we get out of it. Okay, so that really sets up where we've got to, and hopefully that's been pretty clear in terms of why we're looking at this and why we're trying to go through a process of involving all those with an interest in GEO LDN to to really try and make sure that the data standards are something that are usable. So now I'd like to go on to a process of discussing with you the different standards that have been proposed. And like I say, these are in draft, and also getting your opinion. So get ready with the chat box because I'll be asking for you to interact with the process in a couple of slides' time. So first off, I just want to quickly highlight a few things that have been raised through the consultation process so far, but that we're going to park today, and these will be dealt with elsewhere. So first off, on the left-hand side of your screen, you should see data fusion and data validation. These are going to get moved into a sort of round of further consultation because of the complexity of the issues that are being discussed there. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see 5 topics, all of which are going to get moved directly into the good practice guidance update. And so we're not going to discuss any of these today, but just to make you aware that people are looking at these, and they have been assigned places to be taken on further. Okay, I just want to highlight that what we are about to discuss are the proposed minimum standards. So these aren't going to be the sort of like the highest bar you've got to get. These are going to be the things that you really should be hitting in order to have good data quality standards. And these are recommendations that have been made out of the process so far. But what we really need at this stage is your opinions in order to try and obtain some form of consensus. So just to reiterate, we are now entering the current step in this process. Okay, the first 2 proposed standards are what I've termed cross-cutting, and this means that they are applicable to data across all of the 3 sub-indicators. In case you're not familiar with this, there's 3 sub-indicators are land cover change, land productivity, and carbon stocks. And we'll be coming through, as we go through the slides, we'll be discussing these in turn. So the first proposal here is that analysis-ready data should be used where possible. And this is something that is becoming more and more talked about in terms of Earth observation and the products that are derived from it. So this seems like a very sensible proposal at this point. It's also important to understand the processing lineage of a data set, and that's where that sort of information will get captured alongside the use of analysis-ready data. So the next step proposed cross-cutting standard is the temporal coverage of various data sets. And you can see here that I've got 3 things listed: annual, 3 years, and the same as global. And these relate to the 3 different sub-indicators. So for land cover change, there's a proposal that the products should be updated annually. For the national land productivity sub-indicator, there's a proposal that we should be aiming for a 3-year product reporting, but it has also been acknowledged by those involved in the process so far that this is quite tough to attain. And then from the national carbon soil organic carbon stocks, we'd be looking at a temporal coverage that is in line with current global products. So the next cross-cutting standard that I want to raise here is the idea of grid cell size or pixel size. And the minimum standard that's been proposed is to use 100 meters as a grid cell size. So this is where I'm going to put things out to you. I'm going to put a question out to you, and hopefully Michael will be able to post the question in the chat as well. Would 100 meters be suitable for your LDN monitoring and reporting requirements? And how does this relate to your existing country data sets? It'd be really, really interesting to get your views on this. So if you could move over to the chat pane and start to maybe respond to this. Is 100 meters attainable or not attainable for you? what are you already using? What sort of grid cell size do you want to use in terms of your processing power and things like that? So if you have any opinions or thoughts about the use of a 100-meter grid cell size, please do add them in at the moment. Just give you a couple of minutes to do that.
And just please remember to place it in the chat that's all panelists and attendees so we can all see it.
Okay, so whilst you're thinking about whether or not this is a suitable standard, maybe I will just move on to the next slide as well. That's brilliant. Thank you. We're starting to get some good responses there. Thank you very much for that. Okay.
So the comment is that if you have a comment that's very related to your country, be sure to mention the country so that we can connect that back. It's not required otherwise, but if it is relevant, please add it.
Okay, cool. So we're going to move on to the proposed standards around the land cover change sub-indicator. And on this slide, we have a couple of proposals. One is that within the cover classes, a national product should be looking to use hierarchical class structure. It should also attempt to aggregate to a reporting scheme. And one of the schemes that was mentioned in the process so far is the SEEA scheme. And also that the product needs to be able to attain internal consistency across various different dates. And all of these come together within the land cover product that is generated at a national level in order to create some form of comparability between different countries. And using these standards really helps that. And then looking at a way of being able to aid this comparability, we need to have some form of legend translation. And again, what's been proposed is the land cover meta language. And there's lots of documentation online as to how this can help. And I'm aware at the moment as well that this is getting upgraded and reviewed at the moment. So it's a very live process and a very important part of the whole land cover and land cover change thematic area. So next, we just want to look at the proposed land cover change standard of how we actually go about assessing that change. And the proposal that's been put forward is to use a form of accuracy assessment. So what this means is that change assessment will need to reach a minimum accuracy value to provide a standard target without restricting countries to a specific method. So what I'm going to do here is ask a second question about these standards. And what are your opinions on using accuracy statistics in order to look at change assessment? And do you have a current national accuracy target for land cover products? This would be country by country basis. In one of the survey responses, one of the countries did report their national accuracy target, which was really helpful for us to understand what sorts of values we should be looking at in terms of maybe providing information either in good practice guidance or through the standards themselves. So again, if you're if you're able to, please open up the chat and please put your opinions about using accuracy statistics, and make sure that, as Baron mentioned earlier, that all panelists and attendees is selected. This is great. Thank you very much for your inputs. There's some good discussions, points being made here. So someone has asked who defines the data to be collected. Well, so part of this process is to allow national level data sets to be created. So those people who are on this call would be using some of these proposed standards if they get moved through to be actual standards, in order to then try and define and obtain the data and create the data sets themselves. So that's why we have approached the data users and the national data providers for this specific workshop. Brilliant. Okay. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on, and we're going to start talking about the second of the sub-indicators, and this one is land productivity. And there's a number of standards that have been proposed for land productivity, and we're going to start with the vegetation index. So in order to look at productivity, we need to find currently a suitable proxy for net primary productivity, and it has been suggested that NDVI is a good standard, a minimum standard to attain. So what I want to do here is just understand what your thoughts are about the use of NDVI for looking at productivity monitoring in your country. So for instance, what we are looking at here is whether or not you currently use NDVI to track vegetation productivity and vegetation vigor in your nation, in your country, and whether or not this is something that you think is a good minimum to be able to attain through data. So really, if you have any ideas about the use of NDVI, then please, again, put them into the text chat now. I realize that there are multiple different indices that can be used. If you're using a different one, that would be interesting to understand as well. So please, like Baron said, mention your country and what you are using. But bear in mind that this NDVI is, we are proposing this as a minimum standard so that countries could be compared between different different regions and things like that. Brilliant. There's some really good inputs being made here. Okay. So again, if you have any thoughts about any of this, carry on typing those in, whilst I just go to mention some of the other standards that have been proposed around land productivity sub-indicator. So the first one is that there's a need to try and link data sets across time, and that one of the best ways to do this could be to use linear regression. It's a nice and easily implementable minimum standard, and it seems to have good results. The second one here is this harmonization between indices, and that ties in with some of the comments that have been coming up in the chat regarding NDVI, is that NDVI might be the minimum standard, but actually you might have a much better data set that you've been using with a different index. So we need to understand how we can harmonize, say, an EVI with an NDVI. And that one way to do that is to look at levels of change within an index over a time period. And so the standard here is that really we should be looking to report those levels of change rather than stating specific methods of doing things. So it's going to come down to countries would be able to choose their index, and that as long as they report the levels of change within an index, then that should help harmonize between the different indices. And then the final one on this page is how to define the growing season. And quite a long discussion was had about this in the previous part of the consultation. And the proposed standard is that using a proportional method would make sense rather than an absolute method. So the proportional method would take something such as, say, a minimum value of NDVI, and then would maybe add 10% on to that minimum value in order to give you a threshold. And it's the 10% part that is proportional rather than, say, an absolute value of whatever index it is that you're looking for. And that allows the different indices to be able to define the growing season across different indices, but also if the phenological year is used as a default, then it creates a form of global parity. Okay, so I want to, the last of the land productivity proposed standards is probably the most contentious one. And this has generated a lot of discussion and debate, both in the surveys that we've put out and also in the previous workshops that we've had. And this is all to do around climate calibration and normalization. And this is a very complex issue that differs according to biome and geography. But it comes down to whether or not some form of climatic calibration should be applied to the signal for land productivity, so your NDVI time series. And the proposed standard is to not apply anything, to leave the data as they are computed. And what I would be really interested in understanding here is whether or not you would be required, given your particular geography, to undertake some form of calibration or not. So what is your opinion of using uncalibrated and non-normalized productivity time series data? So do we just take the NDVI time series as calculated, or should we be taking account of the effects of climate and rainfall and seasonality and that sort of thing? So again, if you can put some comments into the chat box, that would be really helpful. This is one that's quite interestingly seems to really split people in terms of their thoughts about how data should be processed. So getting as many opinions as possible around this is really, really critical, I think, to making sure that we have a good series of standards around this area, or at least suggested standards. I mean, maybe it would be that having uncalibrated data is perfectly fine for your national requirements. Or maybe not. So we've seen that first comment back is that it should be calibrated. Is there a reason why you would like it to be calibrated? This is great. Thank you very much for your inputs here. Again, if you could maybe mention the country that you're would be doing the analysis for, that would be helpful, just to understand maybe the reasons behind why calibration or normalization would be useful to you. Brilliant, thank you. Great, thank you for your inputs on this. Seems to be quite a lot of answers at the moment for calibrated. So if you have an opinion other than that, that would be, now would be a great time to also make it. Okay. So carry on adding in your opinions into the text chat. That would be really helpful. I'm going to move on by one slide. And by moving on, we come on to the third and final of the sub-indicators, and that's carbon stocks. And we're looking at soil organic carbon in this case as an indicator of that. And there's a couple of things that are being proposed here as standards. One is that any uncertainty assessment that is made on the soil organic carbon or the carbon stocks themselves should be reported at a pixel level, if possible. And the other one is that the soil inventory update should occur every 10 years in order to get a good understanding of what's happening with the soil. And this is quite an interesting one because 10 years seems quite a challenge. And so I put that challenge to you. Going to be discussing carbon stocks and whether or not a 10-year national soil inventory update is attainable. I'm going to do it in a couple of ways. It'd be great to have your input in the text in a moment, but I'm just going to try and launch a poll. So you should see a window in front of you at the moment with a poll. Great, that's good. Good to know it's worked. So please start voting however you think is a 10-year national soil inventory update attainable? It'd be really interesting to understand what people's thoughts are on this. So I'll leave that for a while. I can see the votes are beginning to pour in. And whilst you're voting, or once you've voted, maybe have a think about the reasons for your choice on the vote, and then move over to the chat and put in those reasons into the chat. That would be really useful. And again, maybe mention your nation or your your country or your affiliation for your organization, just so we get a good understanding of what's driving some of the opinions here. So we've had 60% of people on the call have voted so far. So if you're in the final 40, please do check out the poll window, which should have popped up in front of your client or your web browser. Just coming up to 70% of people voted. Oh, I should just say, do feel free to vote. It's not a binding vote. That's great. There's a few more left. We're just coming up to 75% of people. So I'll give it another 30 seconds or so. So if you want to have a vote, that would be great. And then, as I say, if you want to put any information into the text chat about any of the questions, but particularly about the reasons behind your choices here, that would be really useful. Okay, so I will end the poll there. Thank you everyone who interacted with that. So I will just quickly share the results, and you can see that actually that's quite interesting. So yes managed to pip it, but only by 2% from the maybes. That is fairly equal throughout all of those. So that's an interesting result in itself. That's great. Okay, so like I say, if you have any thoughts about any of the standards or any of the questions that have been asked as we carry on throughout the workshop, then please just put them into the text chat and maybe make a note as to what you're discussing, so that we're able to reference it back when we come to look through the chat. I just want to move on to the decision trees, and what I want to say here is that the decision trees are very much in a process of being developed at the moment. And the idea is to try and help data users and providers understand the data selection process. So rather than just accepting the defaults, maybe national and subnational monitoring and reporting can adhere to the data standards as well. So the aim is to try and guide data choices. What I'm about to show you are some first draft decision trees. And like I say, these are currently in a process of development. So we're not stating that these are the trees that you will be using, but what we're asking you is there anything about these trees you want to change? Is there anything in terms of decision tree usage that you want to see in an ultimate end product around this? So I accept that this is a very complex and confusing slide. And so what I've done is tried to break it down to explain what's going on here in terms of these decision trees. So at the moment, it's probably best that you don't read through everything. But what we're trying to get at here is a sort of yes-no decision from a series of different nodes as we go looking at the data standards. And so that's the important thing to know is, yes, can I do something, or no, can I not? That's the main important issue there. And as we go through the various different flow paths within the decision trees, you end up at these blue arrows. So on the right-hand side, you can see that maybe you would end up being asked to use global data, or maybe you would want to contact Working Group 1 in order to talk about capacity building and that sort of thing. Or it might be that you have to go out to the good practice guidance documents and find out a little bit more about how a certain standard can be applied and that sort of thing. And then on the left-hand side, you can see that it might be that actually you get guided to another decision tree in order to try and take your data standards process right the way through to an endpoint. And then up at the top left of this, what I want to be able to say here is that we are trying to add in some notes as well for the national data providers and also the global data providers. So if something happens where maybe a product doesn't quite meet the standard, then we could at least sort of state here why that would, what it is that might need to be done in order to go back and maybe recalculate some data and then jump back into the decision trees and go through it. So this is really what I wanted to provide in this slide, is that there's this idea of starting at an incoming node and then going through a series of yes/no processes in order to get to various different endpoints. So I think probably the best way to explain what this might mean is to go through an example. So let me just start with this. So first off, we're going to come at this. I've got my data, and it's like, do I currently generate an existing national, subnational, sub-indicator products? Yes, I do. So I'm going to jump down the yes column into this. So okay, so next I want to know, well, okay, my standard is to use 100-meter cell or pixel size. Does my existing data input data do this? So I check it out. Yep, it definitely does. So I can jump to the next one. That's great. And the standard is to use analysis ready data, as we've discussed in the previous slides. Does the input meet this standard? Well, yes, it does. I used analysis ready data in order to generate this. So the next thing is, okay, do I need to mosaic or composite my input data? Well, actually, I do, because I've got quite a large area. So I need to now jump out over to the good practice guidance. So you can see that the yes arrow goes to the blue arrow that points out to the good practice guidance. I go away, I check through the good practice guidance. I understand what it is that I need to do in order to mosaic and composite my input data. And then I come back to the process of the decision tree. I've got everything I need in terms of my input data. So which sub-indicator am I interested in? Well, in this case, I'm going to be interested in land productivity. So what I need to do here is jump out to the land productivity decision tree. Okay, so I land on a page with my land productivity decision tree. And the first thing I get asked is, okay, what is the temporal coverage standard for national data? Do I meet the 3-year period that's being stated as the standard? And luckily for me, I do. And the next point isn't really a question, but it's just a reminder. So that land productivity products require a long time series. And that if I'm using different base data sources, I need to be able to link these together somehow. And if we remember back a few slides, the standard that was being proposed was linear regression. If I need to find out more, I can zoom off to the good practice guidance documents, have a look through that, understand how to apply the linear regression, and then come back to this process. So the next point is, okay, so the minimum standard for computing spatial productivity is the NDVI index. Do my data allow computation of NDVI? And yes, they do, so that's great. I can now click on to the next one. However, NDVI is just the minimum standard that's being proposed. I am able to determine what I want to use. So am I going to use a different index? So in this case, yes, I'm going to use EVI, I think. I fancy that's going to suit me better for my national needs. So I'm going to jump off to the right, to the yes box, get a little bit more information from the good practice guidance, just to make sure that I'm following everything that's being worked up in the data quality standards process. And then I'm going to jump down to the next part of the decision tree. So there's a whole series of things here, and I'll just quickly go through these in order to sort of demonstrate how this might work. And so I've got my EVI data, and I need to be able to make sure that's harmonized. So I'm going to be, it's just reminding me here that the standard is to assess and report levels of change for an index. So that's great, I'm going to do that. If I need more information, I can pop out to the good practice guidance. The analysis must also account for growing season. And again, the standard, if you remember back, was to use proportional methods. If I need more information on that, good practice guidance is always there. So that's great. And then the effect of seasonality and climate. The standard currently is not to apply normalization, but I think I will. I think I need to do that. So I'm going to go yes, but I also need some guidance on how to do that and what different methods might need. So that's where the good practice comes in, so I can pop out there. But once I've done that, then I know that my national data are LDN standards compliant. So that was just a very quick idea of how these decision trees might work and how we might be able to go through them. But as I say, a lot of this is changing. Even in discussions yesterday and this morning about putting these slides together, a lot of ideas have come together from within the group about how decision trees might be developed further and changed. So I would like to take this opportunity to ask you what you thought of those decision trees and what guidance would you like from the decision trees themselves. I realize that what we showed you, what I've just shown you, is very much a step-by-step type of decision tree. I would be open to any comments you have on what you've seen in terms of the decision trees. That'd be really, really useful. Is a yes-no process really helpful to you? Is it too constraining? What sort of things do you want to see from a decision tree? So again, if you can just pop over to the chat and make sure that all panelists and attendees are chosen, then please do have your say about what you've seen in the last 3 or 4 slides. That's great, thank you. Brilliant, thank you. Some good opinions coming in there. So carry on having an opinion on the decision trees. It'd be really useful at this stage to understand what sort of thing you would want out of this sort of guiding yourselves through the various different standards. That would be really important. Cool. Just give you a moment more. before we move on. Okay. Brilliant. So I will leave you to have a discussion in the chat as we go on. So we've got to that part in the agenda that I showed right at the beginning of the workshop that we'll look at additional questions. And there are two that I want to ask here. And the first one is really around if you're involved in planning or sustainable development for your country, and I know there's quite a few people on the call who should be looking at these types of things, how would these standards and decision trees help you in your work? So maybe outside of the LDN process, is there anywhere where these standards and these decision trees would just aid generally in making the use of Earth observation data and Earth observation products more useful? So again, if you want to maybe jump into the chat and put down some thoughts around how you might use these standards and decision trees in in areas outside of the LDN, that would be really useful. And specifically, like I say, if you're involved in planning or sustainable development. So yes, please add into the chat box anything about whether or not these standards are useful to you at a national level in terms of planning and sustainable development. That's great. We're still getting some opinions in as well about the previous questions, so that's brilliant. And whilst we're on this additional question slide, I'll also add the second question as well. So a lot of the discussion that we've had in the update consultation really enhances the global to national monitoring side of things. But how does this approach help to enhance national to local monitoring? And that's really what we're trying to understand in this workshop, is the national and subnational use of data. So any thoughts you have really about the applicability of any of what we've discussed in terms of data quality standards and decision trees to your national and local monitoring for planning or sustainable development work? It would be really interesting, again, to capture opinions in the text chat. That's great. I can see some really good answers coming in. Thank you. Brilliant. Okay. So if you continue to think about various different things that we've discussed, but in particular maybe these additional questions, and you think of anything, then feel free to add those into the text chat. I'm just going to pass back to Michael now for the final sort of words and wrap up of this. So Michael, over to you. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Alistair. Yeah, we would like to just find out, have we covered all the bases here? Do you have any further comments, maybe something that wasn't in the categories that we saw, that we kind of designed for you? Anything miscellaneous that you'd like to add to that? And again, it's really important to have all panelists and attendees activated there so we can all read that, but this is your chance for last feedback, maybe last questions that we'll probably have to deal with later. But before we do our final wrap up there, we have a couple of minutes left, and we'll be asking you, of course, for feedback. So what other comments do you have? What other messages do you have for us to take? Okay, I'd like to move on to feedback. Of course, this is for a lot of us, this is a kind of newer format here, and we see a lot of meetings going on, and of course we want to optimize ours as well. So I'd like to ask you, what feedback do you have for us? So we phrased that into two basic questions. What did you particularly like about today's session, if you'd like something about the session? And think about next time. What can we do better next time? What improvements would you like to see? So those two questions, if you would please put them into the chat box. What did you like? What can we do better? And again, all panelists and attendees, it would be important to have that activated. Okay, already some suggestions. Thank you, Chu. Yes, Sasha. We've got a slide for that. So what did you like about, what was good about today's session, and what can we do better next time? Thank you, Chu. Yes, as you can imagine, the larger the number of people, the more difficult it is to have orderly kind of interaction with each other. We would love to have heard all of your voices and seen all of your faces, but with over 100 people, it can be a real challenge. Great. So feel free to continue posting your feedback in the text chat. In summary, mechanisms are required in the reporting process for capturing all the changes away from the standards. And keep in mind, we are creating a technical note based on the consultation process. And as we mentioned several times, this is a highly complex topic. And it is rather positive to see the progress that is being made in use of Earth observation around the world. That as a kind of summary for today. And of course, we have a lot of people that we would like to thank. And first of all, to all of you for your contributions in the text chat, for being so willing to openly contribute. thank you very much for that. Your input is very important. And of course, to all of you who have answered the data user survey and have answered that in the short period of time that was available. And of course, all of you involved in the data provider, data specialist consultations, and to everyone involved in the GEO LDN Initiative, the Data Quality Standards Update process.